cool name tags.
Cool, what?
You have the little name tags on the bottom left.
Oh, you got to be a panelist. You're a host, so you don't get that fancy
Yikes.
name tag.
I've never seen that before. It looks like a
Me
new.
neither. I thought it was like a Raimi
Josh.
Sherwood thing.
No, it's just a webinar specific thing.
Well, I think we've been hacked by Josh. He figured it out.
Oh, wow. Josh made himself a panelist too. Or wait, that's weird. Huh. Because it wouldn't even let us rename ourselves. So we ended up using these name taggy things.
Oh. Right click your name in the panelist list. The option is under change appearance.
I'm gonna go try to find a lamp next door. Be right back. Lighting's.
You won't find one in my office, but good luck.
Daniel, can you promote me so I can, or you can just promote Monica. When I left, it kicked me off being a host.
Okay.
Another thing we didn't discuss, Brian, but I assume it's easiest if I share screen. Or would you prefer to, Brian?
Brian stepped away to find a
Oh,
lamp.
Sebastian, Jenna, do you guys have a preference?
Sorry, can you say that again?
You prefer to advance slides yourself, or would you like me to?
I'd prefer to if I have the option. Where do I click on that? 'Cause I'm not sharing the deck. Oh, we lost Ron.
Oops, I think I. Nothing wrong. Whoops. There we go.
Sorry, I got demoted and then re-promoted. Thank you for that exciting trip through Zoom land.
I'd prefer to click slides if I can, but I'm not going to be sharing the deck, so I'm fine with somebody else clicking for me.
Well, you can if you want.
Show me this technology.
It's up to you. I mean, we can just swap at some point if you prefer.
No, I'd prefer to not have the active presentation in front of me. So
Okay.
I'll tell you when to click.
I will anticipate. And if I'm wrong, you just tell me.
Great.
So Brian, why don't you just let us know when you think we should go ahead and get started?
Well, it's 6:34. Yeah, we should get started.
Everyone see the slides well enough?
Yes. All right. Well, we are recording, right, Daniel? So
We are recording. Yes.
all right, I can't see everyone, so thank you.
There we go.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone. I hope everyone's settled in nicely. Thank you so much for your participation this evening. And it's quite warm outside, so hopefully we're all settled in with a nice tall glass of water. And thanks for your attention and your interest. And we'll spend the next couple hours here jam-packed with content as we make our way not just to the end of the year, but also a little bit closer to getting us with a comprehensive general plan update for the city of Petaluma. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Daniel just to do a check in roster count, please.
I'm sorry, so normally we have the interpreters introduce themselves, and I'll go ahead and assign that role on this slide.
Yes, thank you very much. Good evening. Buenas noches, me llamo Mónica. Estoy aquí con mi pareja de interpretación, Catherine. Estamos hoy aquí como intérpretes. Hoy este evento se llevará a cabo en inglés y en español. Se usarán ambos idiomas activamente, así que usted podrá elegir un canal para participar en su idioma preferido después de que le hayamos explicado cómo funcionará la interpretación. Estaremos usando la función de interpretación de Zoom. Después de que termine esta explicación, se activará la función de interpretación. Si usted está conectado con su computadora, verá un icono de un mundo en la parte inferior de su pantalla. Si está conectado con su tableta o teléfono, pulse el más y verá un menú que incluye la opción de interpretación de idiomas. Para escuchar la interpretación, pulse el icono del mundo o interpretación de idiomas y a continuación elija su canal de idioma. Thank you. We're ready.
Great.
Thanks, Monica. And Daniel, I don't know if you see, just before you jump into this one, it looks like Phil's having trouble getting in. You see him maybe in a waiting room? Phil
Bill
Boyle.
Wolpert. Phil Boyle. I do
H.I.
not see him in a waiting room. He should be a panelist and he should be able to access through the link. He can email me if he needs support. But I don't see.
Phil Boyle present.
There he is. Hey, Phil.
Great. Okay. Excellent. And Brian, do you want me to go ahead and read our note about general public
please
comment
do.
for the evening? Okay, great. We just have a kind of a brief message for general public comment for the public. So I will go ahead and read it for everyone. Given disruptions that have recently occurred at other local government meetings, this is to remind members of the public that meetings held by the City of Petaluma are limited public forums. This means that the right of the public to speak is limited in comparison to the public's right to speak in a traditional or designated form, and the city can make reasonable restrictions. One such restriction is comments must be on topic within the General Plan Advisory Committee or GPAC subject matter jurisdiction. These limits are consistent with the United States and California constitutions, as well as the Brown Act concerning limited forums such as this GPAC meeting. With the mayor's permission, I will assist them in identifying public comments that are not within the GPAC subject matter jurisdiction or pertinent to an agenda item to help us efficiently conduct business on tonight's GPAC agenda without disruption. If a speaker's comments are not on topic with topics within the GPAC subject matter jurisdiction or are not pertinent to an agenda item being discussed, I will ask the moderator, which is myself, to mute the speaker so I can remind the speaker to limit their comments to topics within the GPAC subject matter jurisdiction or an agenda item being discussed. If the speaker fails, after a reminder to limit their comments as required, I will permit the next member of the public to speak. So thank you in advance for your cooperation. And Brian, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Daniel. All right, next slide for roll call. All right. Thought I saw Dave. Dave?
Here.
Hey, Dave. Stephanie. And Phil, we just saw Phil. Aaron. And I believe Mary is sick, so I don't think she's joined us this evening. Jesse is not with us. We'll circle back there. Allie, thought I saw Allie.
Yes, I'm here.
Hey, Allie. Yancy.
Here.
Oh, Sharon.
Here.
Roger.
I'm here.
Eliana.
Present.
Roberto. Brent. I saw Chris earlier. Hey, Chris. Bill. Or Bill Reinhardt. Josh Simmons, I saw. Elga. I saw Lizzie. Hey, Lizzie, and Bill Wolpert.
Here.
Hey, Bill. All right. Well, some of you might have, oh, sorry, just to sit on the last slide just for 10 seconds. Some of you may have seen the email from Jessie. So if you haven't, I know she's not here with us this evening, but she, due to a number of reasons, she's unable to continue, as part of the GPAC. And so she sent over just her well wishes. And so if you get a chance, if you haven't seen her email, I know she would appreciate just dropping her an email and saying thank you. All right, next slide. So again, just some logistics here, Zoom instructions. It sounded like everyone was able to join, so I'm not going to go through this. I think the only one worth mentioning if closed caption is needed, there's the button right in the middle at the bottom of your screen. And I don't see anyone that joined by phone, so I'll skip that one. Next slide. And just rules of engagement, just given the number of people in the audience or joining us today, please make sure we're using the raise hand feature to speak. And our moderator for the evening, Daniel, will call on people and just walk us through that process. And so GPAC, the team will call on the GPAC members individually. And so if you could just remain muted until you get called on, I think that'll help with keeping the noise down and order. Next slide. And excuse me 1 second, I have I'm at City Hall and they're starting to vacuum, so close my door. Okay, and so any technical difficulties, please email Daniel or just send a chat or over email. I'm monitoring that as well. Next slide. And please remember to speak slowly. Our interpreters are working hard to translate accurately. This is a much more of a reminder for myself to reduce the use of acronyms, make sure to explain them when you do use them. Next slide. So we've done roll call. I'll walk through a few slides just to provide a general overview, staff update, project updates. And then as we had discussed when we last had our GPAC meeting, the primary topic of the evening will be to discuss a number of flood resiliency strategies. So we'll start that off with a presentation, and similar to our flow, we'll set some time aside for GPAC member clarifying questions. If there are any members of the public that want to raise any questions and comments, we'll have that opportunity, and then we'll open it up to the larger GPAC for discussion. And then the final topic of the bulk of the meeting will be to just talk a little bit more about working groups. We have a poll, so we're looking to finalize that. There's a lot of content, so similar to how the frameworks were broken down by working group, we'll take a similar approach there. So we're maximizing all of your time that you're spending here with us. And then we'll close with any thoughts from the group. And then again, if there's general public comment, we'll hold that time at the end of our meeting as well. Next slide. Next slide. All right. Well, it was so nice to see a number of you in person. We had the open house, the Climate Action Commission, at the conclusion of that open house, spent some time talking through our blueprint. And so this is a public document now live on our website. There's been a lot of outreach, and there will continue to be a lot of public engagement and participation. many thanks to Cool Petaluma for partnering up and getting the word out and for their level of engagement. So it's been really nice to this has been a long time coming. The city has had the bold goal of carbon neutrality in about 7 years here, and so we're really excited to hear from the community on the draft framework that we've presented. There's been a number of requests and there's so much content, and so we've extended that public review period to the 17th of November. We have an ad hoc as part of this GPAC, and so they'll be working hard between now and the 16th of November, and we'll get a brief presentation as the whole GPAC at that meeting. And so thanks in advance for all your efforts and any guidance that you're able to provide on our action plan. Next slide. Roadmap. The star has not moved since we last connected, but we have been making a lot of progress. We're still marching well on our way to get to land use alternatives. There'll be a slide. I think the next slide will sort of walk through the next steps here, but just wanted to keep the bigger picture in perspective that we are on a good path. And again, this is a critical path for us this evening to talk through the different strategies related to all that new information and flood data that we received at our previous meeting. And this just goes into a little bit more detail of the work that's been completed to date. And so again, just an extra note of gratitude to the advisory committee here for getting us to this point. So everything from the existing conditions, so January 2021, right? So this was been countless hours from this group, and so thank you for that. The certification of the housing element and all that came with that, getting the action plan out on the blueprint, the amount of detailed work, not just from GPAC members, but the staff and our consulting team to talk through and get us to a point where we can have a good conversation about sea level rise and resiliency and adaptation to that future that we're going to experience here in Petaluma, both in 2050 and 2100. And the frameworks, a lot of work that went into that with the ad hocs, and so we're getting ready to produce sort of that final draft for public review. Next slide. And where we're at, we're right into this here. And so again, action plan on carbon neutrality. We'll have the working groups. We'll talk a little bit about strategy around flood resiliency today. And that'll tee us up really nicely to start talking about land use. And then speaking of land use, immediate next steps. This is where GPAC will get the first cut, the first presentation on the land use alternatives and the policies, and then we'll start a much more robust dialogue with the community about what those alternatives will look like as part of the general plan. Next slide. And that's the big goal that we're aiming for here. Summer of 2025, more or less 1 year of a process from next summer to summer of 25, where we'll be really deep into the EIR and the environmental review. So again, a lot of work that we need to do to get to that point, but it's really exciting just to think through how we can, or when we're projecting to have an updated general plan. Next slide. And so this is today, the discussion on the strategies. We will be looking for a November 16th, and so that's the next GPAC scheduled meeting, initial discussion on land use. We'll take a bit of a pause in December as a GPAC as a whole, but we're looking to take what time that we'll have during the holidays and just fitting it in between holidays to break up into ad hocs. And then we'll culminate into the January GPAC meeting when we can start getting all your great input and ideas on what those alternatives will look like. Next slide.
You want me to take this, Brian?
Please. Thanks, Ron.
Hello, everyone. Good to see you. Thanks for taking time for this important meeting tonight. The GPAC working groups are actually an agenda item after the discussion of the flood resilience strategies, but we wanted to briefly touch on them here because we'd like to open a poll during the meeting for you to complete. And then we want to look at some of the results together at the end to inform our discussion of working group composition. So we thought it'd be helpful to say, just do a little bit of a refresher here. You've seen all this before, so it's nothing new, but just a reminder that the purpose of these groups is to make recommendations, basically to inform the planning process. They're all completely voluntary. We would like to have at least 2 GPAC members on each working group. They're for the most part self-directed, self-coordinated, and self-facilitated, although we'll do what we can to support the operations and meetings and collaboration amongst working group members. And part of the advantage of them is part of the purpose and advantage is to have GPAC members working directly and collaboratively with other community members. And that's one great thing about Petaluma is it's full of people with lots of passion and expertise around a range of topics, all of which are relevant to the GP. So it's a great way to engage them. And just as a reminder, we kicked them off last year. You guys spent a lot of time last spring and summer developing initial recommendations, which influenced and directed in a significant way the development of policy and strategy ideas. And then the housing working group specifically, while we are crafting the housing element, was a great resource that we were able to meet with on a regular basis to discuss some specific housing element, specific site issues and policy issues. It was great to have a small group to engage around that. And so they're a really great resource for this process. And we want to do a little reorganization and re-engagement at this point in preparation for the working groups taking a deep dive look at the policy frameworks. And so this slide you've seen before, but it's basically on the left-hand column is showing the original groupings and participation. The middle column is what we're proposing as the 7 working groups at this point. There's some similarities, but also some new elements. And then on the right is the policy frameworks that we anticipate each of those working groups taking a close look at. And so at this point, we're gonna put a link to a quick SurveyMonkey poll in the chat. Michelle, if you could do that, and we'd ask that if you just quickly complete this while we're proceeding with the meeting, we'll look at the results together at the end to help us kind of confirm whether or not we've got equal representation across working groups. Some of you we know have already responded with a sense of your interest in specific groups. Thank you very much for doing that. We'll certainly, we got that information, we'll build into this. If you as a courtesy would again complete the survey, it'd be helpful because that way we'll be able to look at everybody's responses together at the end of the meeting and get a sense for where we may be missing some members to fill certain working groups. So thank you very much. It's a short 7-question poll. In addition to some questions about the working groups at the end, we also ask about your availability for and ability to meet in person or online at the November 16th meeting. We ask because, as Brian mentioned, we do hope to dive into land use at that meeting. And much in the same way that it was handy to be in person, to be able to look at flood maps during the previous GPAC meeting, it'll be very helpful if we can to look at land use maps together in person at the November meeting. So we'd like to get a sense for people's availability and ability to meet in person. So there's also a question in the survey about that. And at this point, just want to pause to see if there are any clarifying questions from GPAC members. Can anyone, if you haven't received or seen the link in the chat for the SurveyMonkey poll, can you raise your hand? Everyone's good? Okay, excellent. All right, any questions about anything Brian presented or about where we're headed with the working groups at this point? Being nothing, I think we'll go ahead and proceed. Great, thank you, Brian. And at this point, we are gonna dive into a synopsis of the summary you received in writing last week of the initial flood resilience policy and strategy ideas. Before I hand it off to our flood resilience team from Sherwood Consultants or Sherwood Engineers, I want to just say a few words because I'm sure questions are going to come up related to this. We've already received some comments by email from folks about this. As you know, one of the great things about a comprehensive plan like a general plan is that they touch nearly or can touch nearly everything in the city, and that's certainly the case for Petaluma's general plan update. The challenge, however, is that state law requires that GPs cover certain elements or topics. And also for ease of implementation, it's often helpful to organize a general plan by certain topics or elements. And so we end up taking both a somewhat focused, but at the same time integrated and interrelated approach to these plans. To date, we've been doing that largely based on the expertise of our team members. That being said, we anticipate that when we get to drafting the admin draft, we may organize things very differently. But given where we're at, part of the challenge is we end up touching on some topics, particularly many topics that we know are very high priority for the community across a range of different policy frameworks. And that certainly is the case for flood resilience. So what we've got on the slide here is just kind of an example of some of the related topics that are covered in other policy frameworks. For instance, safety very much complements the flood resilience work. It addresses other hazards in much in the same way. It also speaks to the importance of resilient critical infrastructure that if you've read the materials we sent last week, that's also touched on in the flood resilience framework. Likewise, natural environment, tremendous amount of connection and overlap. The rivers, a significant centerpiece of that, as are open space, green infrastructure, low impact development, and other means to conserve resources. Those are certainly connected to flood resilience, but we're keeping them for the time being in the natural environment policy framework to focus on all that from an ecological perspective, but we do recognize the interconnection there. Also, extremely importantly, land use, as many of you have already noted, is central to flood resilience. We absolutely recognize that. However, given the timing of the flood maps and the desire to move concurrently both on the flood resilience policy development and the land use alternatives, we made a decision to do that in parallel. And so what we did is handled the flood resilience land use aspects through the land use alternatives. And so we'll have a great chance to talk about that next meeting. And we kept everything else in the flood resilience framework. And so it's not that we don't agree that future land use and how we handle that in the land use policy map and the general plan is going to be critical as a component of flood resilience, as you'll see that it's not currently a central component of the flood resilience framework. So we recognize that. We're happy to talk about that tonight, but anticipate diving into that more specifically at the next meeting. Likewise, other elements speak to several other topics that are related to flood resilience, including Parks and Rec, which also addresses kind of the recreational aspects of the river, public facilities, which obviously relates to the importance to plan future public investments with projections of sea level rise and flooding in mind. So I just want to note again that there's many interrelated topics. Tonight's conversation is focused on those that are covered in that strategy paper that you received last week. And at this point, then, I am going to turn it over to our friends at Sherwood Engineering. It's an international civil engineering firm. They've got a main office here in Petaluma, as well as San Francisco and New York. They do lots of different types of design and consulting with a focus on engineering solutions that benefit social and environmental justice. They've done flood resilience and sea level rise projects around the country, including in several jurisdictions in the Bay Area. Just to clarify, Sherwood was a sub-consultant to West Consultants for the flood modeling and mapping work, which was the topic of the last GPAC meeting. But Sherwood is also a key member of the general plan update team, focused on flood resilience, as well as utilities and infrastructure, and specifically water-related infrastructure. So Sebastian Birch, Sherwood's lead for all of this work, has been leading Sherwood's climate resilience teamwork in Petaluma since 2020. Sebastian is joined tonight by Jenna Scott, one of Sherwood's design engineers in the Petaluma office, who has also been central to the development of the draft flood resilience strategies we're discussing tonight. So at this point, I am going to pass it to Jenna, who will then pass it to Sebastian.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. So as I'm sure we all know, flood resilience is a really in-depth topic. And so I want to highlight right before we get into the presentation that one of the attachments for this meeting is a list of draft strategies with a lot more information and a lot more detail about everything Sebastian and I will talk about tonight. So I highly recommend having that on ready to go on another screen or printed out to reference. To give you an overview of what we'll talk about today, I'll go through some of the key technical terms, as well as the existing conditions and the way that Petaluma thinks about flood resilience right now. Then we'll turn it over to Sebastian to recap the updated flood modeling and walk you through the meat of this presentation, which is our ideas for strategies. So looking at terminology, again, there is 2.5 pages of definitions in that handout, and we've selected only a couple to really highlight here. So I really recommend taking a look at that. But a couple of the key stakeholder agencies that we'll be referring to today are the American Society of Civil Engineers, ASCE, who publishes guidance for engineers and municipalities, and the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, and they are the regulatory body for flooding. There's also a couple of hydrologic terms here. The floodplain is basically anywhere that might be flooded, and the floodway is essentially the river. And when we talk about sea level rise, we're talking about the increase in the ocean water elevation, which has an impact on all the water around the world. Next slide. A couple of the more technical terms you might not be as familiar with. The base flood elevation is the elevation that FEMA says, okay, there is a 1 in 100 chance in any given year that a flood will reach this level or higher. And that's what a lot of regulations are based on. The finished floor elevation of a building is the lowest point of an enclosed space, including any basements or machinery. And the flood insurance rate map, or FIRM, are the maps published by FEMA that tell you if you are in a special flood hazard zone, and if so, what base flood elevation, BFE, you should plan for. Next slide. So those terms were pretty industry standard and they're easy to Google. Some of these adaptation and regulation terms are a little more nuanced. So to get everyone on the same page, when we talk about adaptation, we are talking about any action that reduces our vulnerability to flooding. And when we use the phrase adaptation pathway, we are talking about a strategy with 3 components. There's the current requirement, something you do right now, a triggered condition, which might be time or another measure like sea level rise, that tells you to take the third component, the future heightened requirement, and spreading it out this way means that it's not as expensive to implement adaptation right now. And there are pros and cons to this, but we'll get into it later. A couple of the project regulation terms. The project lifespan is the amount of time that we expect any building or other project to serve its use without any structural changes or any, adaptive reuse. And risk tolerance is the how comfortable you are with letting your building get flooded, essentially. So an easy analogy might be if you're picking out clothes to paint in, you would probably pick out your old high school marching band t-shirt because you're okay with getting paint on that. It has a high risk tolerance. Whereas you probably wouldn't want to wear a tuxedo while you're painting that has a low risk tolerance. So next slide. We're going to get into some of the key findings from existing conditions, primarily from the local hazard mitigation plan in 2020. It found that there were significant, not only were there significant lands of all uses at risk from flooding, but also that 5 critical utility stations were also at risk, which means the entire city is at risk. And crucially, sea level rise makes that worse over the next 80 years. And as we talked about before, Sebastian will get into some of the updated modeling that the city has taken on in a little bit. Because flood resilience is so universally important, it was really important to take a lot of community direction from this group and from the community at large. One thing that really aided Sebastian and I in drafting these strategies was the GPAC's working group, GPAC working groups draft strategies by Roger and Jesse. We echo a lot of that language in our actions and our policies. And at the end of that handout is an appendix listing exactly which goals, policies implement that language. And I think if we go to the next slide, some of the ethos that was really important to us in drafting this was being a leader and taking action now to address the future impacts of climate change. So going into the next slide and talking about what we're currently doing, I want to really emphasize that even though, flood resilience wasn't a chapter in the previous general plan, that doesn't mean that we aren't, being flood resilient. We are using FEMA to determine who is at risk and how at risk they are. That's understanding the problem. Next slide. We are regulating development, mostly using Chapter 6 of the zoning ordinance to regulate development within the floodplain and floodway and the Petaluma River corridor. Next slide. We also noticeably are reducing our flood risk by taking on big infrastructure projects, notably the Pay Your End flood wall, but also projects like the Denman basins and improvements in Capri Creek. And finally, it is important that not only is city staff and the city with a capital C aware and involved in planning for flooding, but that everyone around us is as well, including the public. So we comply with state laws requiring things like flood hazard disclosures in all real estate transactions. And we provide, the city provides monitoring for flooding and resources for preparing for and recovering from floods. And you'll see a lot of these things that I've echoed, that I've mentioned here, echoed in our proposed language and just taken that extra step further. So I think we'll take a quick break to get any clarifying questions before I hand it over to Sebastian.
Yeah, thank you, Jenna. Great job. I'm sure the interpreters appreciate the pace at which you spoke. Thank you. Yeah, we did want to pause here because the next step is for Sebastian to take the deep dive into the information that you have in front of you in the written document summary of strategies. But before we do that, any questions about what Jenna presented, either any of the terminology, existing conditions, key findings, input from GPAC or the community more broadly through the vision pillars and guiding principles, or how the city is currently working to be flood resilient. Any questions at this point? Bill?
Yeah, I'm doing a little bit of catch up from being out last week, but Jenna mentioned the flood walls that are being augmented. Can we go into a little more detail about how they're being augmented and are they being built taller? Looking at the flood maps, it seemed like most of the flooding is downstream, and there seemed to be little concern about anything upstream of Payran. And if that's the case, are those creeks really critical to prevent flooding?
I don't know if Jenna or Sebastian, you want to answer that quickly?
Yeah, I think I can get into that briefly when I pull up the maps in a section, because that's a question about the flood model. And we learned some interesting things from that flood model. I'll respond to it in a few slides.
Was just to answer your question, Bill, did you have a question about any of the specific existing flood control projects?
Well, I just don't understand what the criteria is that's addressing the flood walls. We have something that says they need to be raised by 1.5 feet or what? I just don't know what that is. What drove those improvements? And I'm happy to wait for future slides.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, it's all interrelated, so I think it'll be clearer after Sebastian explains the modeling, because they get into the considerations behind the existing and planned flood control projects. So, any other clarifying questions at this point before we turn things over to Sebastian? Okay, seeing none, put your seatbelts on.
All right, thank you very
Go
much. So, first off, we're going to do a quick recap of some of the content from the last meeting about the flood models and the sea level rise selection process. And then we'll take some questions at the end of this. And partly this is because we got some great clarifying questions after that meeting as well. So back one slide quick. So as you saw from Jenna was saying that the first step is understanding the problem. And we do that with maps that predict what the future flood might be as climate changes. So quick recap. The sea level rise projections that are being used for most of the general plan efforts are 1.9 feet of sea level rise by the middle of the century, 3.4 feet by the end of the century. This is coming from state guidance, and it's based on risk factors. There's a lot of different estimates for sea level rise, and one of the important things is not just how high it is going to be, or it might be, but how likely is that? And we use different amounts of sea level rise that have different amounts of likelihood for different uses, different planning purposes. And we could go into that in Q&A a bit if we needed to. One reminder is that all of these estimates are using the assumption of RCP, Representative Concentration Pathway 8.5. It's a climate change model that assumes greenhouse emissions continue to rise for decades, as in globally, we make no progress on climate change for a number of decades. So there's already some safety built into that. We're not being optimistic about climate change. We're kind of using the worst case, business as usual. We don't do anything about climate change. Next. So again, from last time, there's the 3 main potential sources for flooding were considered, and wherever possible using already industry accepted methods. So the 3 main types of flooding for City of Petaluma are king tides, rainfall, and storm surge. King tides are the highest tide of the year, happen a few times a year, even when it's not raining. Tide measurements from NOAA tell us how high the king tide's going to be. So direct measurements of the river. And king tides are already a concern, so we need to think about them because they get worse in the future. Then there's rainfall. It happens every year, but we plan around the biggest rains. That rain event that has only a 1% chance of happening every year. Oh, that's commonly called the 100-year rain event. Now, the third one, fewer people know that we also already plan around what's called the 1% or 100-year storm surge. So how is that different? That's an extreme event where atmospheric conditions like El Nino, Pacific storms, strong winds on the coast can drive bay water up the river and can flood the city. It's based on a totally different set of conditions than a 100-year rain event, and it's almost guaranteed not to happen on the same day, but they have the same likelihood of happening every year. So in any year, there's a 1% chance you will get a 100-year storm surge, just like there's a 1% chance you'll get a 100-year rain event. And a lot of people don't know they're different things because the flood maps we're used to looking at usually merge them together into one big blob. The source for that storm surge information is the US Army Corps of Engineers. It tells us how high they think that river might get from a storm surge. So an updated flood model was developed, and we were able to put into that flood model these sea level rise predictions that say, what does a rainstorm look like when the river is higher? What does a storm surge look like when the river is higher because of sea level rise? So the maps we're going to look at right now are broken into two time frames: mid-century, around 2050, and end of century, around 2100. And you'll see each map is broken into two. So first off, for mid-century, the first one is the king tide in mid-century with 1.9 feet of sea level rise. So how do you read this thing? This is in your packet, but the really zoomed in version is available on the general plan website. And we'll zoom in here in a second. So this map shows the areas that would flood during a king tide, which happens a few times a year, if we have 1.9 feet of sea level rise, which only has a low probability of happening by mid-century. The city outline you see there in orange. Major roads are the black lines. Downtown is there where it says turning basin. Other features on the right, you'll see Lakeville Highway interchange at 101. And flooding is shown by shading the map in colors, from shallow flooding in yellow to the deep flooding in dark blue and green. The yellow shaded areas that you're going to see are less than a foot of flooding. Up to that salmon color is about a foot. From light blue to dark blue, you go from 2 feet to 5 feet of flooding, and anything deeper than 5 feet, which you really only see there in the most extreme bottom right corner, is deeper than 5 feet, the green, which is mostly wetlands and the river. So this map shows what the king tide might look like if we get 1.9 feet of sea level rise. You'll notice you really only see the yellow-blue flooding in the creeks and wetlands with a couple new breakout areas. You also notice that, just remember that these king tides happen every year. So this is a different kind of flood. It doesn't have a 1% chance of happening every year. It's going to happen every year as soon as this amount of sea level rise happens. So let's zoom in. If we zoom in, you'll see the only really areas that changed were this area in the top left, called out by that flooded area. They're on Lakeville. There's a low spot in the city. That's the only new area that 1.9 feet of sea level rise seems to affect. So that's some interesting outcomes for what the map is telling us. Next up, we're still looking at mid-century, but now we're considering the 1% storm, that 100-year storm. And this map shows both rainfall storms and storm surges. They don't happen on the same day, but since they have the same chance of happening, we show them on the same map, the same way FEMA shows them on the same map. So the most important thing that this flood map taught us was that 1.9 feet of sea level rise only changes these areas that have a 1% chance of flooding from the bottom end of the city up to about Washington Street Bridge, so downtown, upriver from there, heading up towards Payran and the outlets, and up the creeks. This amount of sea level rise stops causing extra flooding during the rainfall or the storm surge, mostly because the river starts going up. So the effect of that extra river water stops having an effect. And now remember, these maps don't show impacts, right? They show hazards. They show the areas that have a 1% chance of flooding, but the maps don't know if the building is high and dry. And the maps don't consider that we're probably going to build some flood protection or do other efforts to reduce these hazards over the next 75 years. To Bill, your question, this model considered the flood wall that exists at Payran right now. It considered the Denman flood control projects. It considers everything that exists right now. And what that says is in this scenario, we don't have breakouts above or around the flood wall at Payran. And we'll look at that again when we look at the next sea level rise prediction. But quickly, let's just zoom in. We can zoom in because the model tells us 1.9 feet of sea level rise doesn't change much upstream of Washington. So it's safe to zoom in. And what you see is there's some new flooded areas. You see some on First Street, you see some more on Lakeville, and you start seeing some on Lakeville close to Adobe. And again, looking at the colors, what do the colors tell you? Well, the yellow is less than 6 inches. So a lot of those yellow shaded areas, that's flooding that's constrained to the gutter, doesn't make it to the sidewalk even. The blue is a foot, the salmon is a foot. So that starts getting up out of the street, maybe onto properties. But a lot of that is still confined. This map might show a parcel being inundated, but is the building? Because the building might be a foot higher, or on First Street, there's a lot of buildings that are 3 feet higher than the street. So this shows hazards. It doesn't necessarily show a detailed building specific impact. Next up. And I really recommend people going on to the city website where you can zoom in really far into each of these maps that I'm showing right now. So for end of century, we're looking at 3.4 feet. So when we look at the king tide map with 3.4 feet, what the model tells us is something pretty similar. You start seeing some new areas of flooding, but it's pretty much all downtown. So let's zoom in. So during a king tide, 3.4 feet of sea level rise starts making the king tides worse. We already get some floods from king tides. So, sorry, to summarize, this 3.4 feet scenario it's basically the highest amount of sea level rise that the state thinks is likely to happen by the middle of the century. There's a lower possibility that we get more, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. Also to consider, these maps don't consider any flood protection projects or us doing anything before the end of century.
Just to clarify, Sebastian, I think you just said middle of the century, but I believe you meant end of century.
Yes, thank you. End of century. Next up, it's in the rainfall and storm surge maps that we start seeing bigger impacts. So this map shows the areas that have a 1% chance of flooding every year if we have 3.4 feet of sea level rise. Again, this is assuming global greenhouse emissions keep going up for a couple decades and we do nothing to prepare for the floods. So the main thing this taught us was that even 3.4 feet of sea level rise, the model says that stops affecting things upstream of about the Payran Bridge. And again, it doesn't appear to overtop or go around the Payran Weir. So upstream of those are pretty safe from the effects of extra sea level rise. So if you zoom in, again, there's a lot more area that's affected. We see a lot on Lakeville, downtown reaching 2nd Street and the Boulevard in certain spots. And again, the yellow, less than 6 inches. It's the blue areas, the light blue areas going to dark blue, where you see depths of more than a foot that start posing threats. So this is the map that we're proposing most general plan efforts use. And we'll talk about higher estimates later.
Okay, Roger knew that questions were coming up next, so he raised his hand preemptively.
Oh, I didn't know that.
This will give Sebastian a second to clear his throat. Thank you, Sebastian, for so clearly explaining everything. Sorry that you're having trouble. Roger, your question?
Yeah, I mean, it's very, I've seen an earlier version of the maps, and it was really very clear and really well done. I think, at least the earlier version, so I want to clarify that the third type of flooding is not on these maps, which would be called interior drainage flooding, the inability of the storm drain system to drain against high tides, which, although usually not as bad, I just didn't want people to look at it and say, well, I know this area of ponds on a tide now, so because I don't think that's in these maps, and typically not as bad, and but there are sometimes cases where that can be a source of flooding, and then as sea level rise goes up, obviously the tides stay higher longer, and these areas are unable to drain. So I think that is not shown, which might be something people experience. Is that still correct in these maps, or?
Yeah, Roger, there's an update on that.
Okay, great.
Hey, Sebastian, can you lower your mic?
Yeah, sorry.
Thanks. There's an update on that. We had, from a conversation we had many months
Okay.
ago, the updated way that the storm surge maps and king tide maps were done basically took the current elevations of those flood events and it raised them by the sea level rise. And it said any part of the city that is under that elevation, we assume it floods, even if there's no connection to the river, because we assume there's a storm drain and it's going to run backwards.
Okay.
And tide water is going to pop up out of the grate and flood the area. That's not quite true in certain areas. We know the city has put in infrastructure, little gates that prevent that happening in certain neighborhoods. So that some of these extents are probably already protected. So that was considered in these maps that you've seen. What isn't considered is something like is that area might be protected by a pump station that pumps the water out. It doesn't, what the map also doesn't consider is what happens if you're well away from these areas, but your storm drain is clogged with leaves and it backs up and floods. It doesn't, the model can't consider that.
Yeah.
And that does cause issues in certain places. So
I think it's a good point brought up that as we get to adaptation, there might need to be more pump stations, very expensive and more common. And also what I think is also another impact is obviously groundwater tracks with tides. And then you have just constantly higher water. And, the groundwater impacts is kind of a known thing. So, but I think for what you're showing here, it's the major, obviously, sources of flooding. And then finally, I'm actually seeing a lot of, for design purposes, people are using not for valuation, but designing. God, the numbers are creeping towards 6 feet by the end of the century, which is crazy high. But seems to be the upper end of the new state guidance. For if you're going to build a levee or something or a wall, you want to take it to probably a little bit higher.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about those really high estimates in the policy section. Thanks for bringing that up.
That's a great presentation.
Any other clarifying questions at this point about Sebastian's recap of the updated flood SLR maps and modeling? Thank you, Sebastian, for doing that. We knew not everybody was at the last meeting. It'd be helpful to review these because they're so fundamental to many of the strategies being proposed. So thank you for bearing with us on that. So at this point, why don't we go ahead?
Bill, I thought I saw Bill's hand
I'm
up.
sorry. Did I miss somebody? Sorry.
But Bill Wolpert, did you have your hand up?
Yes, I did. Thank you. I had a couple questions actually. One, how was an atmospheric event? And I assume that could be an atmospheric river event. You listed that differently from a rain event. Why is that?
I don't quite know where you're referring to it being listed differently.
Yeah, you had it on one of your lists of various events. There was a rain event, rain or storm event, atmospheric events, and then another flood event.
Yeah, so that's split between the two kind of big sources that are used for the big floods that have a 1% chance. There's the rainfall flood and the storm surge flood. The rainfall is the one we're used to talking about, a big rain event that only has a 1% chance of happening. A confusion comes in because we frequently talk about those really big rain events as atmospheric rivers. It's the phenomenon of clouds that move these massive amounts of rainfall to us. Those really extreme rain events, atmospheric rivers, are factored into the flood model. There was a really extensive effort to update the precipitation models that drove the flood map. So atmospheric rivers are considered in the rainfall floods. And then in the storm surge floods, what's nuanced about a storm surge flood is there might not be any or a significant amount of rain during that 100-year storm surge. The rain might be happening somewhere over the Pacific. It might be happening somewhere else. Those are atmospheric conditions like an El Nino or wave action or pressure zones that have forced a ton of water into the Bay Area, and that has forced it up the river to us. And so those atmospheric conditions can drive the storm surge, even if there's no rain in the city itself.
Okay, I had some other questions. I'm going to let those slide for right now. But NOAA's determined that atmospheric rivers are becoming more common, and they are going to continue to bring us the majority of our winter rainfall. Since our peak rain season is in December at the same time that we have king tides, why aren't those two things considered together?
So the model, this is great. This came up at the last meeting. So the model already somewhat does consider a king tide happening during the same time as the rainfall. The model assumes that the river is at mean high or high tide, so the higher of the high tides for the entirety of the rain event. And we know that's not true. We know during part of the rain it'll be down at low tide. But the model, using precedent set by the Army Corps, assumes the river stays extra high the entire time. And king tides are actually somewhat factored in to that mean high or high water. What the model doesn't do, you're right, is say, what if you get the atmospheric river peaking at the exact same time that the king tide is peaking? And the reason we don't do that is because the likelihood of that happening at the same time is very low. It can happen, but it no longer has a 1% chance of happening. It has an unknown percent chance of happening, significantly less likely. Is that now have a 1/10 of a percent chance of happening? Does it have less? That's an unknown factor. And it would make that model, that flood map, very difficult to use, because we need to have an amount of risk that is comparable to the other ways that we currently consider floods. The other thing is that for most things downtown in the lower areas that are subject to direct flooding from the river because of impacts from storm surge, the storm surge method already kind of does factor in a king tide, because it factors in the river being really significantly high, and it's actually a higher level than king tide has ever been. The Army Corps estimates for how high the river is during the 1% storm surge are very conservative, higher than has ever actually been measured in the Petaluma River. So there's a lot of safety factor built into that. And again, what we're seeing is the impacts of rainfall floods are really more up the city, and the impacts from storm surge are more down the city. And so there didn't appear to be a good scientific basis to have the rainfall happening during the king tide, because we're pretty much covering the risks from the king tide in the storm surge process where king tide has any chance of having an impact.
Yeah, I don't think storm surge is a big factor here in Petaluma. But last year in December, we had a rain event. It was a good rain, but you know, not record breaking. And a couple days later, we had king tides, you know, maybe within 3 to 5 days. The river was still high from draining the watershed. And I was standing at the end of C Street at the river, and the outflow from the storm drain was underwater, and you could see the river level about 6 inches below the storm grate. And it was a sunny day, it was beautiful. And so the convergence didn't occur exactly, but it wasn't a remarkable weather event. And yet the street was 6 inches from flooding. And we're only looking at projections getting worse. And it just seems like it just sounds very conservative to me. And we're not taking into account the reality. It's my opinion.
I see Roger's hand raised. Bill, I know you said you had several questions, but I'm wondering if, Roger, your comment is specific to this topic, or is it something else? Sorry, you're muted.
Bill's question prompted me, because it kind of goes to Bill's comment, in that, and we're being sort of water geeky here, but when we talk about a 1%, so that's a recurrence interval, how often it happens, 1% chance, but there's a zillion different kinds of 100-year events, so we should talk about the duration too. So that kind of gets to what Bill's saying. Atmospheric rivers tend to be not very peaky, but a lot of water, so they might be equivalent of like a 48 hour storm or a 1 week event. So we should probably say we're modeling 100-year. And when we do storm drain work, often we're dealing with the very small, very peaky storms because we're looking at great inlets and stuff. But for these big floods, we want to probably say 48 hour, 100-year event, or 72, or I mean, I've seen, which is kind of the equivalent of back-to-back or a very long atmospheric river, high volume, low intensity, or maybe looking at both. So I just wanted to say, I think we talk about rainfall, we need to specify two things. And that kind of gets to what Bill was saying. He's seen atmospheric river, a lot of water events that keep the river high. I certainly see that in Marin in Nevada, where it'll stay several feet above normal stage for a week or two, just due to the fact that it keeps raining slowly, but a lot of volume. Sorry.
Brian, is your comment related?
Yeah, well, I think great points raised both by Bill and Roger. Sebastian, I wonder if maybe when we start talking about the mitigation and resiliency strategies, there may be some strategies that we start to talk through that may address some of these questions that are being brought up. And if not, we could, we have time, right? We don't need to solve it this evening. I don't think we're going to solve everything this evening, so.
Yeah, I think it'd be great to have a more
move.
in-depth conversation about the modeling process and assumptions that were used. And maybe that's a working group thing.
Well, sorry, I meant since the bulk of the topic this evening is to talk through mitigation and resiliency strategies, I wonder if some of those strategies will answer or resolve some of the concerns that were raised. That's all.
Yeah, some of the resilience strategies do draw a distinction between, is the property subject to flooding by a king tide? Well, that's a different concern. It's so much more likely to happen than a property that's only subject to a 1% chance of flooding. So we are kind of trying to outline a process like that, which is somewhat new for the city because FEMA doesn't care about the king tide. It just cares about these 1% events. So I guess I'll just go back to saying the models that were used to develop these maps didn't directly say, what if the river is at king tide for the entire day that the rainfall is happening? Those really high tide events are factored in to the other assumptions about how high the river is while the rain is happening. And the model was also stress tested, calibrated to, and what it showed was that with the assumptions that were made about the river being at its median, at its high tide for the entire day, what the calibration really said was that matches very well to how we know the river performs based on actual measurements of creek and river elevations. So that was reassuring. And the other one was there was some stress testing done with the model to see how much effect that a momentary peak of a king tide does have on the peak events. And really the way this model works, those possible areas that might flood in those situations are already shown to be flooding because of other reasons. So it didn't appear to be necessary to directly overlay those two scenarios, king tide happening exactly during the 1% rain event, when the flood model is behaving how the current data is saying it should, and we're already factoring in these kind of extreme tides. Doing the direct combination of those scenarios creates a map that we don't know how likely it is, which makes it a really difficult planning tool. That also goes for the map is based on the current understanding of rainfall patterns, a pretty rigorous study. What it doesn't do is consider rainfall might be a bit worse in the future. And there's very different estimates about how much more intense the rainfall might get. And it doesn't just matter how much more intense it is, it matters, does it happen over more days? Does it happen with back-to-back storms? There's a lot of variables. And so that's another area that some policies in here are pointing out a future area to improve collaboration with other regional authorities like Sonoma Water about updating our understanding once there's better science. It was possible to throw a pretty rough number, maybe rainfall gets this much worse, but the problem is if we make too many assumptions without a firm basis in data, we end up with maps that we don't know how realistic this is. And so part of the policies are also trying to build, we know the data will improve, we know our maps and models will improve. How do you set up the policies now that can evolve as our understanding of the flood hazard evolves? That's the critical thing now. We've got a good model. We can base things on it now. It's not perfect, no models are, but what are the policies that let us use it now and let us update the model in the future?
Thank you, Sebastian. And those are great questions. And as you can see, get Sebastian started on these geeky technical questions, and it's hard to get him to stop. So, but
Sorry.
thank you, Sebastian. As Brian mentioned, as needed, if people continue to have questions about the methodology of the modeling or mapping or anything else, I'm sure we can take time to do that. In the interest of time this evening, though, we would like to get into the specific draft proposed goals and strategies so we can talk about those and still have time at the end of the meeting for a broader GPAC discussion. So unless there's other burning questions about material we've covered so far, I'd like to go ahead and have Sebastian continue to introduce with the goals and strategies.
All right, thanks. So if you go to the next slide. So we've gotten to the surprising, this is now the technical part. We're looking for your input for the structure of our draft goals and policies. So there's a lot of actions that are being considered, a lot that have been provided by the community in this group, and a lot that are still being worked on and need to be informed by more input from you guys. What you have in front of you in the packet is the ones that we're ready to share, that we need input on. What we're going to be doing is walking through the goals and the policies and some of the actions. There just won't be time to discuss every possible action that we've been mulling around. Then at the end of the goals, we're going to have time to discuss. So I'm hoping we can get through all 4 goals and policies. There's a lot more detail in your packet. So you'll notice in the packet there are some things in regular text, those are actions, and then there's some more background guidance comments in italics. and hopefully we have time to get into those more deeply during Q&A. So as a reminder, so this framework dabbles in possible policies around land use, but that is really being developed in a separate document and will have its own meeting. This is more focused on flood resilience and flood adaptation. We're looking for guidance. Are our 4 goals, do they encompass the needs of the city? Do the policies address future flood resilience? Are we missing policies? We're also welcoming feedback on specific actions that are in there. General plan, it's a comprehensive planning tool. It won't be able to contain every detailed action item, but we're trying to ensure that the public draft that's being worked to at least supports the actions that you think need to be shown. Next up. Overall, we're going to go through 4 goals. Here are the first 3. The idea here is that this is a process. We start, just like how Jenna summarized the city's current flood resilience practices now, we've restructured the general plan to really focus on that process. Number 1, we understand the problem, how floods might impact the city in the future. Then goal number 2, flood resilience 2, we make plans and regulations to reduce our future vulnerability to flooding. And then thirdly, FR3, we reduce the future risk with projects. Goal number 4 isn't shown. It's a collaboration process that happens at all phases of this. So now we're going to go through these one by one. Goal number 1 has 3 policies in it. Under each of these policies, there's going to be actions. In goal 1, we make policies which will drive how the community understands the problem from future floods. We do that with flood models, with maps, and by building an additional policy tool called an overlay. So next. Goal number 1 is that the city uses the best available science and data to understand the potential impacts of the climate crisis on flooding. Policy A says to use the best and most current data and guidance from reputable sources to predict future conditions that affect floods. Exactly the conversation we were just having. What is a reputable source, and which inputs are we using to predict the flood? That data will change over time as the science improves, but we need to agree as a community on what sources and standards to use. Policy B is to improve our understanding of floods with the best computer model, the best flood model that considers all of those variables. Next up. So in policy C of goal 1, we reap the benefits of that previous effort. So this policy gets more detailed. We're going to spend a second here. What it does is it outlines the overlays the city will use to guide planning for future floods. This isn't a new idea. We use an overlay right now to guide the city. It's called the FEMA firm map. We're all used to seeing it. But that shows us the current hazard from flooding, which isn't good enough. We're not going to stop using that overlay. We can't. We're obligated by FEMA to continue using that. It's critical to addressing the current hazard, and it really helps us keep our flood insurance premiums down. What these proposed overlays in goal C do is add extra layers to guide projects. There are 3 of them. 2 maps are shown here because we're still working on the 3rd. One of them, the first one, is for efforts that'll only exist until the middle of the century. And then there are 2 for most other projects, which are expected to last until at least the end of the century, which is most things that will be built. The reason we need multiple is that some projects need to be more resistant to flood than others. So you need 2 maps for the end of the century. And based on feedback from the last meeting, an overlay that's considering even higher levels of sea level rise, 6.9 feet by the end of the century, is being developed for those very few land uses and projects that are really critical to the safety and emergency response in the city. So in your packet, you'll see more detail in FR1C about how are these overlays developed, what's in them. And you've seen this data before. We were just looking at it. the areas that these overlays described. The maps we looked at of 1.9 feet, that's the mid-century. 3.4 is one of the end of century, and a 6.9 map is being proposed for very specific projects at the end of century. And we're going to discuss more how these are used in a later policy. So the last policy of goal number 1 is policy D, and it is about understanding the impacts of those maps. Because just because an area is shaded within one of those overlays doesn't mean hope is lost. The flood might be less than 6 inches. It might never make it out of the gutter. The building in that neighborhood might already be higher, which the map doesn't know about. The overlay doesn't know that the building is higher. So this process says, now that we have a better map, we can look at a detailed evaluation of what gets affected by that flood and how bad is it affected. City already does this. They evaluate the impacts from current and even future flood risks in the local hazard mitigation plan, last done in 2020. Now that we have much better maps, we'll have a better understanding of the economic, the environmental, the social impacts of these future maps. And this is a really critical part of the ecological and social justice component, is who is affected, what is affected, how is it affected? That brings us to the end of goal number 1, which is understand the changing potential flood impacts, what might be impacted and how in the future. Then we can move on to number 2. Goal number 2 says, this is about making plans and regulations which reduce our vulnerability to flooding in the future. We already have a lot of these policies, but they focus on the current risk. So we need to, in addition to that, add consideration for future risk. Now, this is a really tricky subject because we need to balance the needs of now with the needs of the future. So the flood maps we're just looking at, they describe a flood hazard that has a low or very low chance of happening at different times in the future, 25 to 75 years in the future. The current city policies make us address current risk, but we want to also build some safety for future risk. But it's not practical to build everything or rebuild everything we have now for a long-term risk that might not happen, that has maybe even a very low chance of happening even by the end of the century. So we can't build all of our resilience now, but at a minimum, we can plan for that resilience, make sure we're not building ourselves into a corner, and we can be ready for what actions have to happen in the future, decide what the community will do, how we'll do it, and when we'll do it. So there's a balance to be found between how much do you do now and how much do you do in the future. But a critical part is we need to know what we're going to do in the future. So we'll get into more of that in a moment. So first off, goal A is the main connection we have with the land use planning conversation that you'll be having soon. The current general plan process will be able to use these maps that we were just looking at to inform the land use decisions that are being made right now in the next, during this general plan update. And you'll hear more about that in separate meetings. But the fact is, we're still working on understanding the ramifications of how future flood hazard could affect the city. We have this model. We can explore the possible flood impacts in much more detail than we've ever been able to do. So a lot more work is needed. So what this first policy does is it outlines some actions to continue that effort that might not be possible to do during the current general plan effort. The critical part of policy A is a flood adaptation master plan. So this is a citywide document that continues the work of the general plan. There is a lot of work to do because we can't just plan on every building individually being resilient. That's not a really effective approach. The whole city needs to be resilient. Flood hazards in the city are really nuanced. They're really varied. Some parts of the city are vulnerable to rainfall flooding, some to storm surge flooding, some to both, some to extra because of king tides. So we need different policies and projects to address those different risks. We need a plan that decides which parts of the city will be protected with levees, flood basins, which will be adapted by hardening or raising buildings, which areas need land uses to change over time. We need to make and fund detailed plans for how the city will evolve in that way. The general plan can and is doing some of those things, but this general plan will guide us for the next multiple decades. This will be an ongoing effort. Next slide. So you've heard this word adaptation quite a lot. This document, the focus of this document is adaptation. There's a key idea here called the adaptation pathway that Jenna brought up. So we can't, and probably shouldn't, build everything right now to be invincible to the worst possible flood condition that might have any chance of happening in the future. It's just not practical, and it would prevent us from addressing a lot of the other concerns we need to work on right now. You know, wildfire safety, air quality, housing crisis, and some of these adaptation efforts, if we do them now, might have big carbon emissions. That's a thing we need to consider, and we only want to do them if we absolutely know we need to do them at the appropriate time. But we need to know what those efforts will be, and we need to make sure we leave the space to do them. We need to make sure we're ready with the know-how to do them, the funds to do them, and the community support to do them when they're needed. That's where an adaptation pathway comes in. It's got these three main things. First off, right now, we need to make a plan and document all three of these things, but not everything gets built right now. There's a current requirement starting here on the left. That's what we have to do now. Then that first arrow to the right of current requirement is time passing, maybe decades, as we continue to experience climate change. At some point, a trigger condition is reached. That's some measurable thing that everybody has agreed to beforehand, would be the red flag that says now's the time to do something. That's the cue for us to adapt and meet the future requirement. The future requirement was already agreed to. We agreed on it today. It was already planned for. Ideally, it was already funded. That second arrow after the trigger happens is, again, time elapsing, because we know it'll take time to do that future requirement. For some projects, the adaptation might take years, it might take decades if the adaptation process was something big, like major flood protection infrastructure. So the trigger needs to leave enough time to do the adaptation early enough. So how does this look in an example? So, for example, if we were looking at a flood risk downtown, so there's a current requirement, which is what we do build now. So a current standard for the city might be to build the sidewalk at an elevation that keeps it safe and usable from a flood that happens now, plus some amount extra. We want to build in some extra right now, of course, but there has to be a plan for how that infrastructure is changed in the future to be more resilient to that future flood. So right now we agree on a plan for what will happen in the future and when that adaptation has to happen. As that first arrow is happening, this might be decades. We keep seeing climate change, sea level rise continues, rainfall gets more intense, we get better models. And at some point, we hit the trigger condition. That means we have to do the adaptation. In this case, maybe that means raising the sidewalk, or the adaptation might have been that that entire neighborhood gets protected with a levee or flood wall, whatever that agreed upon adaptation was. And the point is, funds were set aside for it. The community was aware that this was going to happen at some point, and the community decided on what it wanted to see there. So that's policy A. It's a big one. We'll talk more about it in Q&A. Next up, policy B. It's about being ready for when an area is damaged by flooding. Immediately after a flood is not the time to plan, and it's definitely not the time to plan long term. So we need to preemptively decide what are the rebuilding standards in certain areas that are just at too much of a risk from flooding. And we need to make a plan for that now. That's appropriate for the long-term vision the community has for that area. So there are places where after a flood, we need to make a hard decision about, do you allow the same kind of use to get rebuilt? Are there changes to how it gets built? Are there special rules? How is the community going to preemptively decide and be prepared for that? Next up. Policy C is another big one. We'll take our time here, sorry. This is about updating our building and planning standards. So we currently regulate building and projects based on the current flood risk. We're obligated by FEMA to do that, but we're allowed to do more, and we currently do a bit more. What this policy does is it uses the overlays that we talked about in 1C, and that's two parts. First, you have to decide what future flood the project should plan for. There's a lot of different future floods. And then guide what the current and future standards should be. So some of this will be described by general plan actions, and some of the things in here are really so detailed that they'd be documented in something like a zoning code or a building standard. But here's a summary about how we're proposing to use these overlays we talked about earlier to guide building standards of projects and make sure the project aren't adding too much risk of flooding in the future. Again, there has to be a balance here. So here's a summary. We're proposing 3 overlays, like we said before, which add to the current overlay, the FEMA firm. Each project only has one of these 3 overlays that applies to it. So let's go through it. Starting in the top left column, we have the 3 different overlays: a mid-century, an end-of-century low probability, 3.4 feet of sea level rise, an end-of-century very low probability, 6.9 feet of sea level rise. And all on the right column, we say, what does this apply to? Well, the mid-century applies to any project that is only going to live until 2050. That's a short-lived use. And we're proposing that you only really need to look at one sea level rise scenario for that. You look at the worst case because there's not much time before 2050. For the end of century, there would be two different overlays, because there's 2 main categories of projects. Projects that don't have significant threats to public safety and the city's ability to respond to a crisis, and those critical uses that do: the hospitals, the shelters, the police stations, the fire stations, certain uses. So who decides what those uses are? We're recommending, next slide, to pull that from American Society of Civil Engineers. Has its flood classes. Looks like a really big list. Generally, there's 2 things here. Most projects that get built are flood design class 2 for what we're calling non-critical uses, whereas 3 and 4 really spell out very specific, and it's not that many, but very specific uses that provide that are critical to public safety, or very damaging to the community if affected. So emergency shelters, nursing homes, critical utilities should meet a higher standard. So this chart would tell the applicant which overlay do they have to look at. Next up, that chart is in your packet if you want to get more detailed with it. So we're still in policy C, sorry. Here's an example. So down on the bottom left, what we're looking at here is, for example, a non-critical use, say an office, for the that's going to live until the end of century. And right now, what they would have to do is the following 3 things. They would look at their use category from that last slide, and they would tell them which overlay to use. The end of century low probability is appropriate for them. That tells them what the building standards are. There's a current requirement for the finished floor elevation, right? That level of the floor. That's a certain amount above the BFE, the base flood elevation, what FEMA says the flood is right now. The current standard is what you have to build to right now, and it's relative to what FEMA says the flood is right now, plus some amount. We already do a little bit more than what FEMA requires, and we might add to that. We might update that policy to add to it. So, because you want to build some extra safety now, but in most cases, it's not practical so high that we ensure we're above how high the future flood might be. So the overlay also tells them what that finished floor elevation requirement is. You have to build to now, and you have to be ready to build to the future. The future requirements based on a new term you'll see in the document, this DFE, design flood elevation, and that's the height of the flood that the overlay says might happen in the future. The applicant provides a plan for how the project will meet that future standard. It might be raising the building, it might be making the building flood-proof, it might be changing the use of the first floor. There's a lot of different strategies, and that a lot of more detail in later iterations about what might be included in that. So the policy also dictates what the trigger is. When do they have to do that adaptation? We're recommending that that's based on sea level rise hitting a certain amount. You don't wait until sea level rise hits the amount in the overlay, 3.4 feet. You do a little bit before then. How much before that? How many decades do you need to, or years or decades do you need to leave for an adaptation to happen? Now, of course, wherever possible, you want to support and incentivize people doing as much adaptation up front rather than waiting. But there's going to have to be a balance between how much do you do now and how much do you make sure people are ready to do in the future. Next up in your packet, there's a lot more info in here. Happy to discuss. The virtue of the 3 overlays is we can have lower standards for some projects that aren't going to last long. And then for longer lived things, we can have clear guidance about what flood scenario they need to be ready for. Hospital, it's got to have a higher standard than a park or an office. This also passively incentivizes these higher risk uses like critical infrastructure. It incentivizes them to move out of these future flood hazard areas. They could do it inside the hazard area, but it's more costly because you have to plan for the future. So some flood resilience is achieved by this policy 2C. Some resilience is achieved by changes to land use in 2A, and some is provided by city flood control projects, which we're going to talk about here next. So that was goal number 2. Don't worry, it's going to go a little bit faster now. Goal number 2 outlined the regulations and plans. Now we have goal 3. This is where we actually do things to reduce our risk from flooding. The city does things. This makes sure that projects the city is doing aren't going to be at too much risk in the future, and it ensures that the city works on projects to actively protect the community. So first off, policy A is about designing all critical improvements. So this means anytime the city is planning on a critical improvement, that project, just like other developments, uses the appropriate overlay to understand, well, how long is that project going to live? And what's its vulnerability to risk? And what future flood should it be ready for? A fire station should have a much higher standard than a park. And so what this does is starts making sure those things we are building are ready for the future. Ideally, you build a lot of the safety up front, all of it if you can, but you have a plan in the future to adapt, because maybe this fire station really isn't at risk for another 40 or 50 years, but you still need to have a plan for when it becomes to an unacceptable level of risk. What are you going to do? It has to be planned now. This also speaks to a comment we got from some people, I think Roger and Bill, about what about the infrastructure that exists right now? That there isn't a plan to replace it, within the next couple decades. We're also proposing an action in this policy that would incorporate an engineering review of the existing infrastructure to see how is it going to be affected in the future. So some of those pieces of infrastructure, well, they're going to be renovated or replaced or moved anyways. So preemptively make the plan for, okay, we know it has to be changed by this point, but what about those infrastructure pieces we know aren't going to be significantly changed by, say, end of century? Well, that might say we need to speed up our plans to modify them. So there needs to be a pretty comprehensive effort that says, what are the infrastructure things the city operates, and how are they going to be adapted in the future? It can't just be about new projects. We have to look at existing things too. Next up is goal B, and this is about flood protection in particular. So this is currently we build our flood protection to the current floods. That's not enough. We have to start planning for the future floods. So in here are some actions about what types of flood control do we want to see, and how do you preemptively make plans for, say, a flood control project that isn't necessary now, but it's expected to be necessary at some point in the future? How do we make sure we don't use that land for something else? How do we ensure that we set up the funding streams that will make sure there's money for that project in the future? We don't have to build it all now. We have to have a plan for building it in the future. Next up. And last in policy 3 is C. So this goes to that funding streams. There's currently a lack of funding streams for stormwater infrastructure. And we know there's going to have to be more. That last goal needs to tell us, where will we need pump stations in the future? And this goal says, how do we start laying aside the funding for paying for those improvements that we don't need now, but we know we need in the future? So that was end of goal 3. Goal 4 has been happening during all of this. It's a collaboration goal. So starting off, A is really about outreach. How do we engage the community on this? Help them be aware of the risks, help them be aware of the opportunities for adaptation. B is about coordination with regional groups. The floods don't care about the property borders. We need to closely collaborate with the flood control district and Sonoma Water. We need to make sure we're using the most up-to-date data on rainfall, on the likelihood of these joint flood occurrences for watershed-wide flood resilience, and then also reaching down into the bay. We will become more and more over the decades affected by the same kind of flood scenarios that we're seeing down in the bay. Next up, C, how do you encourage new and existing development to be proactive? We've talked about a lot of hammers, a lot of sticks. What are the carrots? How do you support people proactively doing this, building extra resilience now rather than waiting? And 4, how do you support community-driven efforts to improve flood adaptation? So that brings us to the end of the goals. I know there's a lot. Quick summary here to compare to what our general plan does now. The text looked like it's very different, but the overall structure came out to be pretty similar. Over on the left, we've got these goals. Number 1, understand the problem. Our current approach is we understand the current problem. What we're proposing is this is about understanding future problems. 2, our current policies are meant to reduce current vulnerabilities. The proposed approach is, how do you reduce some of the future vulnerability right now? And how do you have a plan for addressing the rest of the vulnerability in the future? 3rd, we currently build things, flood protection, and we build our infrastructure based on the current risk. Again, how do you build to reduce some of the risk now, and then have a plan, be ready to reduce the risk in the future? So now I'd like to open it up with the remaining time to questions. We have some prompts here that we would appreciate. I'll let Ron take it over.
Yeah, we're actually just want to preview these because for folks, we are going to come back to this discussion. We're going to first have public comment, then GPAC discussion, but did want to preview the types of questions that the consultant team is particularly interested in thoughts on. That being said, we obviously welcome any and all comments and questions folks have about some of the proposed strategies. Won't dwell on this now. We'll put the slide back up after public comment, but Daniel, at this point, we would like to turn to public comment. If you could please facilitate that.
Sure. Thanks, Ron and all. So at this point, we will go ahead and open general public comment. Please remember kind of our opening statement. If you weren't here, just please keep comments on topic and related to the subject matter that's been presented in the topic of the meeting item tonight. Members of the public would like to comment, please utilize the raise hand feature via Zoom, and I will go ahead and give you permission to speak and start a timer, and then the floor will be yours. So we'll give it a minute just to see if there are any hands raised. So Ron, at this time, I see no hands raised among members of the public, so we'll close this portion of general public comment and turn it back over to you. Thank you.
Can you just double check,
Sure.
Daniel, that members of the
Yeah.
public, the attendees do have the option of raising their hand, just to make sure. I'm just a little surprised there wasn't any public comment.
Yeah, they definitely should at this point. I just want to make sure. So that would be the default, Ron.
Okay,
Please email me if you are a member of the public and are having any trouble or would like to submit a comment. dharrison@cityofpetaluma.org. I'll also put that in the chat, and we'll be sure to make sure that you are able to provide your comment. But again, everyone should have the ability to raise their hands. Thank you.
okay, so we're now going to turn back to GPAC discussion. Put these questions on the screen just for a minute, just as prompts, but obviously we welcome comment of any sort or questions. I see Dave Alden's hand raised, and then Ali. You could unmute yourself.
No, I think the overall package of goals is logical, intuitive, compelling, but I'm also a big fan of the unintended consequences question. Have other cities done something similar to this? What have been the implementation issues? Any successes or failures you can tell us about?
You want to tackle that first, Sebastian, or?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. There are some precedents for well, okay, there's two things. Generally, this structure of having based around adaptation pathways where you do some up front and then you have a plan for some later. It's a pretty new concept. Ron can speak more to other jurisdictions that have been utilizing it. And so there's a lot that needs to be figured out during to set that up. What are the tools the city has to enforce the future adaptation? What impact does it have on? I think that there's legitimate social equity concerns about what impact does it have on disadvantaged communities in terms of increasing costs. There is data, there is experience based on some other cities that kind of have taken a simpler approach, say 5 to 15 years ago, of how do you add future resilience by taking the current standards and raising them. So rather than taking your FEMA level and going 1 foot above, saying we're going to add some extra safety and go to 3 feet above. There are precedents for places doing that, and you do see increases in cost. And so you need to, what's the long-term cost benefit? Because to not raise the standard now just defers the cost to later, and probably defers the cost more significantly. Even just financial costs, let alone the big thing, which is human safety and community well-being. That's the more important factor. So there are some examples of what's the impact on development costs that we see here. One of the things that this overlay structure intends to do is how does it provide incentives to internalize the cost of added risk? So a really risky project going into an area that has a really high chance of being affected by floods, making sure that that bears the future cost of being affected by the flood, right? Being cheap up front, but having a big cost later, something we want to avoid. And so having this risk-based process where you have certain things are more safe to put in areas that might be flood prone, but this overlay tries to disincentivize the high risk things from those areas. Ron?
Just a couple quick additions. I believe it's the first table in the appendix is a synopsis of some of the resources we looked at specifically for this flood resilience framework. You know, some of it's kind of state level best practices and guidance. Some of it is some specific projects. You'll notice a couple Hawaii examples there. Hawaii has the advantage of being part of a national network of communities that have a lot